You've helped someone, given your time, your energy, your attention, maybe your money, and they took it naturally, easily, without much ceremony. You told yourself it was fine. That's what good people do. They show up. They give. But somewhere underneath the warmth you felt in the giving, there was something else. Something quieter. A faint sense that you had made yourself smaller in that moment. That the exchange, however generous it looked from the outside, had cost you something you couldn't quite name. That feeling wasn't weakness. It wasn't selfishness. It was a signal. Friedrich Nietzsche spent much of his philosophical life examining what happens to human beings when they give too much, not out of abundance, but out of fear. When generosity becomes a habit of self-erasure. When helping becomes the armor people wear, so they never have to confront the question of what they actually want. Nietzsche didn't celebrate cruelty, and he had no interest in making people cold. What he was interested in was power. Not the power you take from others, but the power you either keep or give away through the small choices of everyday life. And he saw, with a clarity that still unsettles people, how often human beings drain their own strength by pouring it endlessly into everyone else. If this is already landing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The first thing to understand is what Nietzsche meant by power. Not domination, not wealth, not status. He used the German word Kraft, force, vitality, the capacity to act on your own values and shape your own life. Every person has a finite amount of it. Every choice you make either expands that capacity or depletes it. And one of the most efficient ways to deplete it, Nietzsche observed, is chronic overgiving, the habit of making other people's needs structurally more important than your own. He called the psychic energy that drives a person's development the will to power. Not aggression, not dominance. The drive to become more fully what you are, to grow, to create, to live with increasing self-command. When that energy is constantly redirected outward toward others' comfort, others' problems, others' approval, it doesn't disappear. It just stops serving you. That's the mechanism this video is about. The first point is the one most people recognize but rarely examine honestly. When you help too much, you train people to expect it. Nietzsche was deeply interested in how habits form, not just in individuals, but in relationships. Every dynamic between two people is a kind of ongoing negotiation, and most of it happens without words. When you consistently show up to help someone, solve their problems, absorb their stress, carry weight they haven't asked you to carry, you're not just being generous. You're establishing a pattern. And patterns, once established, become assumptions. The person you've been helping doesn't become grateful over time. They become accustomed. What was once a gift becomes an expectation. What was once appreciated becomes invisible. This isn't because they're bad people. It's because the human mind adapts to its environment. Whatever is reliably present stops being noticed. The person who always helps fades into the background of a life, valued the way furniture is valued. You'd notice if it were gone, but you don't really see it while it's there. Nietzsche understood this through his concept of slave and master morality, not as a political framework, but as a description of psychological positions. The person who gives continuously places themselves in a position of service. Over time, the relationship reorganizes itself around that position, not through malice, through habituation. The uncomfortable truth here is that excessive generosity often produces the opposite of the respect you were hoping for. You wanted to be valued. You've demonstrated your value through endless availability. And what you got back was someone who stopped working to deserve you, because you'd already shown them they didn't have to. The second point goes deeper. Helping too much doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. There's a specific psychological trap that Nietzsche identified in what he called the morality of pity, Mitleid in German, which translates literally as suffering with. He wasn't against compassion. He was against the version of compassion that requires you to take on another person's suffering as your primary project. Because when you do that long enough, something shifts. The other person's pain becomes your organizing principle. Their needs become the shape your days take. And slowly, without any single dramatic moment, your own life recedes. People who help too much often lose clarity about what they actually want. Ask them directly, what do you need right now? And they hesitate. They've spent so long attending to others' answers to that question that their own has gone unused, and unused capacities atrophy. Nietzsche wrote, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that a person must first become a good friend to themselves before they can offer anything genuinely valuable to another. The line is often paraphrased, but the idea is exact. You cannot give from a position of depletion and call that strength. What you're giving when you're empty isn't generosity. It's compulsion. This is the version of overhelping that no one talks about because it looks so noble from the outside. The person is sacrificing. They're selfless. What they actually are is disconnected from their own wants, their own limits, their own developing life. And disconnection from yourself is not a virtue. Nietzsche would call it a form of self-betrayal. The third point is where the discomfort starts to sharpen. Helping too much is often not about the other person at all. Nietzsche was a precise analyst of self-deception, and one of his sharpest observations was this: people rarely do what they do for the reasons they think they do it. The person who frames themselves as generous, always available, always giving, always sacrificing, often has motives that are far less noble than the story they're telling. Not malicious motives, hidden ones. Chronic overhelping is frequently a strategy for managing anxiety. If I help you, you'll need me. If you need me, you won't leave. If you won't leave, I'm safe. The generosity isn't primarily about the other person's well-being. It's about controlling the relationship so it doesn't become threatening. What looks like selflessness is actually a method of self-protection. The more you give, the more indispensable you become. The more indispensable you are, the less likely you are to be abandoned. Nietzsche called this kind of self-deception a failure of will. Not in the moral sense, but in the psychological sense. The person has not examined their own motivations. They constructed a flattering narrative about their generosity and allowed that narrative to obscure what's actually driving the behavior. The result is that they can't change because they can't see themselves clearly enough to know what they're doing. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this. The person who gives endlessly while actually operating out of fear feels depleted in a way that doesn't make sense to them. They're being so good. They're helping everyone. Why are they so tired? Because the actual emotional work, managing fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, is enormous. The helping is just the surface behavior. What's burning the fuel is the anxiety underneath it. The fourth point is the one that people in these situations most need to hear and most resist. Overhelping corrodes the quality of the help itself. When you help someone from a position of genuine surplus, when you have energy, clarity, and real capacity to offer, what you bring to them is substantive. You can think clearly about their situation. You can offer something true, even if it's hard to hear. You can be present without needing them to respond in a particular way. When you help from depletion, from obligation, from the anxious need to be needed, the help becomes contaminated. You're not really attending to what the person needs. You're attending to what will make them satisfied with you. Those are different problems, and they produce different answers. Nietzsche distinguished sharply between what he called active and reactive states. Active: you originate from your own values, your own assessment, your own centered position. Reactive: your behavior is determined by what others expect, demand, or might withdraw from you. When helping becomes reactive, when you're not choosing to give but rather responding to the threat of not giving, the quality of what you offer degrades. And the person you're helping, even if they can't articulate it, often senses this. They sense they're not getting you. They're getting your performance of you. And performances, however polished, don't actually help people. The fifth point is the one that begins to turn the knife. The people who receive too much often stop developing. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most counterintuitive insight on this subject, and it connects directly to his idea of what enables a human being to grow. He believed, and argued extensively in Beyond Good and Evil, that genuine growth requires resistance. Friction, the experience of a problem you have to solve yourself. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because the process of struggling with something, without rescue, without someone absorbing the difficulty for you, is precisely what builds capacity. When you help someone too much, you interrupt that process. You remove the friction before it can do its work. The person doesn't solve the problem, you solve it for them, which means they remain exactly as capable at the end of the exchange as they were at the beginning. Maybe less capable, because they've learned that you'll absorb the difficulty if they wait long enough. This is the version of helping that wears the mask of love and functions as something closer to control, not conscious control. The person helping genuinely believes they're being kind, but the effect is to keep the other person dependent, unable, needing. The relationship may feel warm. It may feel close. It feels close the way a cast feels close to a broken arm. It's holding something in place that needs to be held, but if it stays forever, the limb forgets how to bear weight. Nietzsche was explicit about this. Real care for another person sometimes requires withholding, letting them fail, letting them sit with the difficulty long enough to grow through it rather than around it. This is not cruelty. It is, in his framework, the highest form of respect, the belief that the other person is capable of developing through struggle, rather than someone who needs to be perpetually protected from it. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The sixth point is the one most people feel but never examine. When you make yourself endlessly available, you signal that your time has no value. Nietzsche located human dignity in self-possession, the quality of knowing your own worth clearly enough that you don't require outside confirmation to act on it. A person with genuine self-possession is selective, not as performance, because they understand that time and attention are finite, and dispersing them without discrimination is not generosity. It is self-abandonment wearing generosity's clothes. When there is no request too inconvenient, no imposition you won't absorb, you are broadcasting something. You're broadcasting that access to you is free, and people treat free things accordingly, not out of malice, out of habit. Whatever is always available stops being appreciated. You become the person no one feels they need to plan around or consider carefully, because you've already demonstrated repeatedly that you'll adjust. The discomfort others feel when you finally establish a limit is not a sign you've done something wrong. It is the sign the limit is real. The seventh point is the most uncomfortable, and it connects everything before it. The person who helps too much is usually trying to purchase something they don't believe they can earn. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment describes what happens when a person cannot act from their own strength, so they reframe their passivity as virtue. The endless giver, examined honestly, is often operating from a quiet belief that their presence alone is not enough to warrant belonging. So they supplement presence with usefulness. They make themselves necessary. They give not from strength, but from the unspoken fear that if they stopped, no one would stay. This is the hardest mechanism to see in yourself because it disguises itself so completely as love. What breaks it is not a decision to stop helping. It is harder than that. The decision to believe, without evidence from anyone else, that you are enough. Nietzsche called this self-affirmation, the foundational act of the person who is genuinely free. The turn is simple. Genuine giving requires a giver, a specific, bounded person with their own limits and hungers. When you give from that position, from actual surplus rather than anxious depletion, what you offer has real weight. People feel the difference. It lands. Nietzsche called this the gift-giving virtue. Not giving out of pity, not giving to manage fear, giving as overflow, because you have built enough in yourself that sharing costs you nothing vital. The path there is not selfishness. It is self-development. Taking your own life seriously enough to become someone whose value is not perpetually up for negotiation. Your power is not something others gave you, but it is something you can give away, one yes at a time, until the person left standing no longer recognizes themselves. Become who you are, not the version made useful and unthreatening to everyone around you. Who you actually are, beneath the habits and the fear. That person has been waiting, not patiently, urgently. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.